Hello, this is Kellie Steinker, and I am presenting on behalf of myself and Professor Rosemary Wildsmith, and we are very pleased to be at this conference. So without further ado, let's get started. The title of our presentation is called Holding the Fort, Capturing How Teachers Teach Reading. We would like to start by giving you a brief overview of the literacy situation in South Africa. It is well known that poor reading skills lead to poor academic performance. Prior to the new government in South Africa, in other words, during the apartheid years, the Threshold Project showed that grade 5s were reading at grade 3 level. We have had over 25 years of democracy, and this situation has not changed. The Pearls, which is run approximately every 5 years, and takes some 50 countries and assesses their reading levels, shows that South Africa continues to come last. Some reasons for our poor literacy situation are poor teacher training, the fact that children from poorer socio-economic areas have a lack of access to print and books and reading, lack of resources in school, problems with nutrition, building infrastructure, the failure of outcomes-based education in South Africa, which was known as OBE, that was changed in 2005. And that was changed into what is our current syllabus in South Africa, which is called CAPS. Unfortunately, CAPS has not seen things improve at this stage. The actual study took place in the Natal Midlands in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and it consisted of 2 semi-urban schools. There were 8 teachers. The first school had English as its language of learning and teaching. The second school had isiZulu as its language of learning and teaching, although this is only until grade 4 when learners have to switch to English in South Africa. Both schools came from poor areas with severe financial restraints. Many of them had informal settlements as their residential areas, their feeder areas. They were overwhelmingly black children. Neither of them had a working library, and class numbers were large in general, between 36 and 49 students. The next slide will discuss the number of teachers and how they were divided. So here we have 8 teachers that were divided into 2 groups. Group 1 consisted of 4 teachers who were using additional reading teaching training, plus the standard CAPS. Group 2 had 4 teachers who may have been additionally trained but were not using it, so they were just using the CAPS syllabus. These are our research questions. The first one is, does additional training in the teaching of reading make teachers more effective literacy teachers? Second question is, do teachers teach as they say they do? We are presenting the theory that underpinned our study and that went into creating the fort. This was a classroom observation instrument designed to capture the teaching of reading, and it stands for the facilitative orientation to reading teaching. So at the very top we have our reading theory, which was Scarborough's rope theory. Down in the left-hand corner, we have classroom-based research. This was what the fort was based on, and it came from the COLT, which was originally done by Sparta and Froelich back in 1995. But Sparta and Froelich's work was done in the second language teaching. We had to specifically design the fort to capture the teaching of reading. Also, the original COLT was designed around constructivist theories, and we were using a more emancipatory theory, a more emancipatory approach to reading, which is now, you will see down in the right-hand corner, we have reading pedagogy, which comes from David Rose. Now this, what we call emancipatory reading theory, comes from the ideas of Bernstein with his code theory and pedagogic device. We've got Ursula Hoadley, Joan Tuff, who worked particularly in the area of discourse and teacher talk, Jim Halliday, who was working with functional grammar, systemic functional grammar. We have Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is the idea that teachers can take students further then the students would have gone by themselves. We have Bruner's scaffolding, and we have Jim Martin, who was working in genre approaches. David Rose took the theories and ideas and work of these people and added a reading component, which he calls read to learn. Here we have a diagram of Scarborough's rope theory. It was the theory that we used to inform and design the fort. So the idea behind the rope theory is that reading, the teaching of reading, the reading, acquisition of reading is largely determined by two main sections, your language comprehension and your word recognition. Any break in those strands is going to seriously hinder the reading process. And here we have under language comprehension, these are your top-down processes of background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, your inferences, your understanding of print and genres. And then we have your bottom-up processes of word recognition. So that's phonological awareness, your decoding, and your sight recognition. So fluency in reading involves all. Now move to our research methodology. And what we used here were the fort, the classroom observation schedule instrument. We made use of qualitative and quantitative data and semi-structured interviews. We also included pre- and post-study reading assessments. We used the EGRA, the early grade reading assessment for grade 3s, and we used the PEARLS, the Progress in International Reading and Literacy Study, for our grade 4s. This slide illustrates the design that we used for the study, and it is a parallel convergent mixed methods research design. It consisted of both quantitative and qualitative data. What we wanted to see was if we were to use these two types of data and we combined them, in other words, the two streams, and we integrated them here, what would we have that we would not have had if we used only one data stream? So our quantitative data was large parts of the fort, which was the frequency, what happened and how often it happened. We had the reading tests, both pre and post, which gave us the ideas of the baseline reading skills and then any improvements that we had at the end. The qualitative data consisted of the activities and the materials. And we captured these in the fort, and it was related to the semi-structured interviews because we had to determine the theories and that the teachers were basing their work upon, that they based their teaching upon, and what were the beliefs and attitudes of the teachers. In addition, we used visual observations. These were very important because it meant going back through the video recordings, looking at the way that teachers interacted with the students in terms of body language. And for example, the students, were they raising their hands? Were they enthusiastic to answer? Did they look bored? Were they staring at the ceiling or chewing on pencils? What was the level of engagement with the lessons? So if we had not integrated these two streams, we would only have had the what and the how often, but we would not have had the why or the how. So the activities and materials and the interviews gave us the why and the how, and then the visual observations helped us to have an additional aspect of it that we could actually look in to see how the lessons were affecting the children, how they were responding to them. In that way, we got a far deeper picture through using this design. This is our classroom observation instrument. This is what it looks like. So what we have here is the fort, which was based originally on the Colt, the Colt that was developed by Sparta and Froelich back in I believe it was 1995. But that original Colt was designed for second language teaching. So what we had to do here was to reorganize this, to restructure it, to design it in such a way that it could capture the teaching of reading, and also that it would incorporate what would be regarded as best practice scaffolding. It was based on the read-to-learn teaching approach and on the works of Halliday and Bernstein. So here we have our organization, in other words, who is speaking? Is it the whole class? Is it an individual student being asked to answer? Is it a different student each time? We then have the category of reading teaching, which includes your top-down and your bottom-up processes. So here we have things like spelling, punctuation, a focus on grammar, a focus on vocabulary. But here we get into the different types of reading. We have decoding here, and we move into the top-down processes of comprehension. So referential, inferential. We have open and closed questions, which is... This is the second part of the fort. It's still part A, but because it's rather long, we have to put it onto 2 pages. It contains the management and materials. So what we'll focus on here is the pacing and sequencing, which are based on Bernstein's concepts of classification and framing, which is boundaries and control. When a teacher is using scaffolding, she is releasing these pacing and sequencing boundaries, and it enables students to go back to what they may have missed. Prompting and discoursing are ways of framing language in order to assist the students. You'll find when you have elaborated interaction with students that it is a way of extending learning and releasing those boundaries and control, because in a fast-paced lesson there is little ability to scaffold or to relax those. Here we have part B of the fort, and we have the interaction between teacher and student, and the student and the teacher. So this is in 2 sections. I'm just showing one here because it's identical on each section, teacher to student and student to teacher. We have 2 main sections: your language, what is the language of learning and teaching, whether the teacher is using code switching or whether the students are code switching to her. Then it has dialogue in different speech events in the categories here, and the fort captures how many times these speech events occur and if they occur from student to teacher and vice versa. So here we have, for example, requesting information, giving feedback, we have evaluation questions, we have repetition, we have giving instructions, we have paraphrasing, we have affirmation down here, and emotional responses are included, as well as responses to difficulties, and a category for other. Other can be when, for example, the students put up their hands to indicate that they want to answer, or whether they get the teacher's attention in some way, or whether the teacher is perhaps encouraging the students to clap, or other issues that we might have that don't. This is a diagram, an illustration of how we converge our quantitative and qualitative data on the fort. So here we see we have our quantitative sections of fort A and B, where we capture the events or the type of interaction that is happening in the classroom and how many times it happened. We link this via the qualitative section, which is the activity and the materials used in part A. The activity is then analyzed using its underlying theory. In order to do this, we need to interview the teacher, and we see her beliefs and attitudes. This was done via the semi-structured interviews. Video lessons were recorded and observed. The information was captured on the fort itself. And by doing this, we were able to determine the level of student and teacher engagement. We did this not just through the information that the fort gave us itself, but also through the repeated observations of the videos. We were able to see the body language of the students, the body language of the teacher. We could see if they were seemingly tired, if they were engaged, if they were smiling, if they were laughing, if they were lying back in their chairs and staring at the ceiling. It gave us a good insight into the way that they either were or were not engaged in the lesson itself. This slide explains how we measured the information that we caught on the fort. In other words, the unit of measurement for the video analysis, it was 5 minutes. Each lesson consisted of 20 minutes. We did this because we felt it would give us the maximum amount of lessons, considering that not all the lessons were exactly the same time limit, and we wanted to keep it as consistent as possible. Each number or value indicated on the graph was representing an average of the frequency or the occurrence of a particular event, behavior, activity within this 5-minute period. So now we go on to our findings, and this will indicate or include the graphs that the Fort data was placed onto, and what it actually looked like once the data was analyzed, and it will also include a discussion. This is the first graph, and it is the reading, teaching, and PCK graph. You can see up here, there's the heading. Now, I'm going to just focus on a couple of categories due to the time constraints. And we see here that group 2, this was the teachers who were only using CAPS, is the orange at the top, and the red graph, the red line here is the teachers who are using the additional reading training. So we can see here that the majority of categories that were used were closed questions. We see familiar word recognition. If we move down here, we see group reading out loud. We see a focus on vocabulary. We see the majority of responses were by individual students. And we see down here that the majority of responses from the class were choral or responses or chanting. What is interesting is that these highest categories for the ones I've just mentioned are all the group that was only using the CAPS. In other words, they were not using the scaffolding. So this would be the teachers who are not using the read to learn. Here we have the management category, and the majority of the categories are used more or less equally by both groups. Pacing and sequencing was not easily caught overtly. I did on 1 or 2 occasions manage to capture a teacher who was deliberately stopping the lesson and going back to something that the students hadn't understood. However, the majority of pacing and sequencing was captured in the qualitative data because it is built into the scaffolded reading teaching approaches. Read to Learn in particular is based around the relaxing of the pacing and sequencing, and that it allows students who are weaker to go back and catch up what they may have missed. So it was inherently built into the approaches, and therefore it fell under the qualitative data because it was in the theories and the activities and the materials of what the teachers were using. So pacing and sequencing on this graph is really what we managed to catch overtly. What also stands out is that the additionally trained teachers were using more procedure, and this was more around the fact that they had more activities in the classroom. They were handing out pieces of paper, scissors, pencils, in order to facilitate certain sections of the scaffold. This graph shows the student-to-teacher interaction. And what stands out almost immediately on this graph is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of it, and that the majority of the interaction from students to the teachers was response to the teachers' cues. We can see it standing out here, particularly in the case of the non-additionally trained group, in other words, the ones that were not using the scaffolding. Both groups were using this response to cue at a very high rate, but the non-ad group, Group 2, stands out considerably. Other than that, we can see that there's very little interaction from, and here we have the interaction from teacher to student, which is quite different from the previous graph. We see that we have all the categories represented, and again, if we pull out some of the categories, we will see that the highest categories here are instruction and requesting information. We have quite a high category for elaboration and response to cue. So we are going to begin with our summary. So group 1 was the group that was using the additional training and using a form of scaffolding. And from the data, we can see that they use comprehension strategies more often, both referential and inferential. They make use of a scaffolded interaction form of reading. They make use of more group work than the teachers that were not using the additional training. They also integrate their language elements such as writing, punctuation, spelling, and grammar into our summary of Group 2. This is the group that was only using the official syllabus, which is CAPS, and they tended to place a limited focus on either referential or inferential comprehension. They concentrated mainly on vocabulary building and familiar word recognition. They maintained a tight control over the class. The instruction and requesting events scored the highest on the fort in terms of discourse, and the majority of this came from Group 2. Reading for meaning did not appear to be a focus in their classrooms, and this is contradictory to what they said in their semi-structured interviews, in which all of the teachers believed that they were focusing on comprehension and meaning. But in actual practice, they were not doing this, which helped to answer one of our main research questions, which was, do teachers teach? In order to finalize our discussion, we need to come back to some of the previous points. We saw that the Group 1, which was the teachers who are using the scaffolding, were using more comprehension strategies. We saw that they were using more open and open-ended questions. We saw that they were using more integrated teaching, incorporating grammar and writing into the teaching of reading in an integrated way. There was more extended elaboration. However, what we saw from both teacher sets was that the majority of students were not responding to teachers, and that when they did, it was mainly response to cue. This is really important. We also saw that the students had a generally overall higher rate to both teachers of group responses. And this indicates that there was not a lot of learner agency in the classrooms. We also saw, and it has not been included in this discussion, but from the pre and post reading assessments, that both groups seem to have had the same amount of reading improvement across the year, regardless of whether the teachers had additional training, and that those improvements were not particularly good. So what we saw was that learners in general had not been moved from decoding to comprehension at the end of grade 3, and that traditional teaching styles and ideas appear deeply embedded. In other words, the idea of teachers using rote teaching methods, repetition, and group responses. It appears that additional reading teaching is necessary, but not sufficient to lead these students to effective literacy. It is shown in research that teacher-led lessons can restrict the learner creativity, and that learner agency or involvement engagement is extremely important. So it appears that aspects of the teacher's PCK, or pedagogical content knowledge, remains resistant, but we do not believe they are immune to change. It just appears that they remain resistant. So what we want to suggest is that coaching could be a way forward. This was recommended in the early grade reading study. Coaching would involve teachers having additional training, but beyond that, actually having a mentor who is in the classroom with the teacher over a period of time to offer additional support. And that this might be more effective in helping teachers to change their teaching style somewhat so as to allow learners more participation, more interaction in the process itself. So that ends our study, our discussion, our presentation, and thank you very much for watching this.